Welcome to the History in 60 podcast, a companion series to AMI's History in 60, hosted by John Loeppky, exploring powerful moments in Canada's disability history. Here in the podcast, we take a deeper dive through conversations with guests who are shaping disability culture and history today.
When we think about disability history, we often imagine major moments, landmark legislation, big protests, or singular turning points. But disability history is also shaped by journalism and disabled media workers. By what stories get told, which ones don't, and how disabled lives are framed in the public record. Our guest today, Clay Ma of Historica Canada and the Canadian Encyclopedia, has spent many years working at the intersection of journalism, marginalized communities, and public memory. Her work includes talking about how disability history appears and doesn't appear, including via the Canadian Encyclopedia. Hi, Clay. Thanks so much for joining me. Just in terms of your physical background, you're in your office.
Yeah, exactly. I work from home. I work remotely. The Encyclopedia pretty much is a fully remote publication most of the time.
So one of the folks that we highlight in the TV episodes that this podcast is companioning is Mona Wimberg, who wrote a longtime column in Canadian media on disability issues, most commonly, also some other local issues. Why did you choose me to write the profile for the Canadian Encyclopedia a few years ago that sort of kicked off this whole thing?
I'm glad you asked this question because at TC, we actually pay a lot of attention into who we choose to write pieces because in theory, almost all our pieces could be written by almost anyone who's a generalist, but TC stands for the Canadian Encyclopedia. We use a lot of shorthand, obviously. We pay a lot of attention to who we want to work with because we really want to focus a lot on people who have similar experiences or community experiences or memberships because I feel that really adds a certain element of humanity that otherwise, an article just generally lacks if you just go with generalists for everything. So obviously, you've worked a lot in disability journalism and stuff like that in terms of topics. But not only that, it's the fact that not only you are part of the disabled community, but also you've worked and done really high quality work in this field. That's the reason that I gravitate toward you. And also, let's be honest, there's not an infinite amount of journalists who work in the disability space, let's be very honest. There's also the fact that journalism, I feel, as a street, and I've worked with a lot of journalists, reputation matters a lot, right? Like having someone who vouches for someone else in your circles matters a good amount. And, a combination of all of these factors goes into choosing who writes what type of TC article.
The Encyclopedia and Historica more generally hasn't shied away from disability-related topics, not just written by me, but written by lots of other folks. In your job, how do you think about memorializing Canadian disability history or making sure that gets told?
I think it really comes back to Historica. So Historica Canada is the broader organization that runs the Canadian Encyclopedia. And one of the missions we have is to ask questions about what does it mean to be Canadian? And to answer this question, part of it comes back to this issue of the duty of representation, right? It's to make sure that publications like the Canadian Encyclopedia truly reflect all of Canadian society and not just the perspectives of the able-bodied or of some specific form or subgroup of the dominant society. Yeah, it really comes back to that duty of representation, making sure that all Canadians, disabled, able-bodied, are all represented and all their stories are being told in an equitable manner. Is
there an area of Canadian disability history that you wish we would talk more about? It doesn't even have to be something that you wish you talked more about in the Canadian Encyclopedia, just that you wish we talked more about in conversation with folks in our circles.
Honestly, everything. I think the topic is just disability in general. I think is a topic that I think, be it TCE or in general, needs to be talked about more. And I think just basing it off my experience working at TCE, it's an impossible job to cover all of Canadian society. And it always feels like I'm covering more. And there's always something more to uncover, to talk about, to publish, to share the story of. So yeah, there's always more people that have interesting stories who have contributed tremendously to the land that is called Canada. And their stories deserve to be told. It's just that it's a question of time, resources, and just, putting it in to publish things. I think based on that also, I think just from the work you and I have done at TC, I think it just in the collaborations we've had, I think it shows I've learned a lot. And I feel that it reinforces my belief that major society can learn a lot from disability space, right? Because I come back to this line that we worked in the article on disability culture you and I worked on. And I think some of the perspectives in there were incredibly insightful. Like, for example, viewing COVID-19 as a mass disabling phenomenon, I think was for me at the time, was very, of course, we collaborated on this a few years ago. It was a very novel approach to me. And I thought it was very, very insightful. And I think dominant able-bodied society, I think, needs to learn more from disabled Canadians and the disability community in general. Yeah, and one way I think that they can learn more is actually, coincidentally, through the lives of people like Mona Winberg, who were activists in this space, right? Who came from the disabled community and were activists in it, and who clearly not only were, of course, they're disabled, but also they had agency, and they pushed for a better Canadian society in general. I think we can all stand to learn from her.
And what I find interesting about Mona, not to make this whole thing about Mona, was part of that was reading her biography and thankfully having a fact checker look to make sure that I read it sort of properly for our purposes, was that a lot of her columns from back then were stretching back sort of 30, 35 years ago. You could transplant them into the front page of any Canadian newspaper and they would feel as accurate today. You might have to, shave off the dates and shift them a little bit, but the issues would be the same. I mean, easy for me to say as a white disabled journalist, but I think that one of the things that I wish we talked more about was Canadian disability history, sometimes intentionally, sometimes unintentionally, can be deeply white in ways that I think we're starting to disrupt in the ways that we talk about people, but still has a long way to go.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, again, circling back to that article we worked on disabled culture, you bring up the issue, the dynamic of intersectionality and how disability plays with all these other different identities. And there's so many people. Canada is such a diverse place with so many diverse people, and everyone's experience is so incredibly subjective, and everyone can bring their own perspective that can be insightful.
I know that Historica and the Encyclopedia have a big push to make sure that this history is accessible to people like students and teachers in schools. From your experience, how do you think we can make disability history more accessible to that audience? Because that's something we bumped into in terms of creating the show, is making sure that it's interesting from a television program to watch, but also that it's accessible not just across disability lines, but across how people may be coming to this material.
Accessibility is massive, honestly, at TC and Historica in general. As you can imagine, accessibility has so many different facets. It's never ending. One thing we focus a lot, actually, is reading level. And this is not 100% tied to disability, but it certainly is related to younger learners, and especially second language learners. TC publishes this format of articles called plain language summaries, which pretty self-descriptive. The point is that they summarize a more conventional article, but in using a lower reading level. And that helps people who are learning French and English as a second language. I've been told, and I know that, for example, these type of summaries are super useful, not just for children, but also for just adult second language learners, because they're about a often normal societal, I guess adult, but not really just adult topic. But regardless, plain language summaries are one of those, because it's about simplifying the content, making everything truly 100% really, really accessible, even for the youngest reader. For example, in English, for plain language summaries, they aim for a reading level of grade 6, 7, if I recall correctly, 7, 8, sorry. So a very early, high school type of reading level. We take alt text pretty seriously also, because for images, making sure that screen readers can catch them and make sure that the images are properly described and not just a generic little line. For those who don't know what alt text is, it's just it's a line or two that describes an image for those who necessarily might not be able to see them, or just in general when the website breaks and the image doesn't load. But it has that dual function, which is interesting.
I, for one, appreciate Historica and Canadian Encyclopedia and some other historical projects in how it can be really easy to make history, even disability history, feel very sort of ivory tower academic, sort of unreachable. Do you have a favorite article, does not have to be disability related, that you've worked on over your career?
Yeah, the one that really sticks out to me is, and this came out last year, was the one on anti-Chinese immigration policies in Canada. And this is not at all about disability history, but for me, it cut really close because my own family history mirrors a lot of the dynamics and history of those policies. I also got to collaborate with a honestly phenomenal author, Naomi Louis, who I met at the Canadian Historical Association conference. Very nerdy, very academic place, but she's fantastic. Honestly, she works with the Chinese Canadian Museum, which is a fairly new initiative also on BC in Vancouver. And it's just a very personal story because it again reflects that personal story when my great-grandfather came to Canada in 1920. And the Canadian government was so adamant about controlling Chinese immigration that they had this very detailed approach to documenting everyone to be able to maintain that state control, right? And because of that, the archival records of Chinese immigration are extremely detailed, to the point that I was able to track down my own great-grandfather's immigration certificates, right?
Interesting. And yeah, I think oftentimes, this is not me speaking your experience back to you. I promise. You know far more than I do. I think a lot of times, like, the disabling aspect of immigration, regardless of background, is something that's often left out of the historical record. Like, even if we look to the States for a second and we think of like Ellis Island or something, disability only ever comes up in the idea of like got rejected. There's not much in the sort of public consciousness about, you know, how disabled people managed to make it when they had no other choice, or when the country that quote unquote accepted them then made them do horrific forms of labor to stay.
You just need to dig a bit into Canada's immigration history to know that it's not at all a rosy picture. And I think a lot of Canadians are kind of shielded from it because a lot of new Canadians especially came in the second half of the 20th century when immigration rules were very much a bit more relaxed. But you just need to dig a bit, right? And you'll find pretty horrifying stories sometimes, honestly.
You know, I was shielded from it. I immigrated here, but I was also born with the citizenship. Right. And like, if I look back even at the rules when I moved here, there's certainly an argument to be made. We will never know. But there's certainly an argument to be made that I wouldn't have been accepted if not for the fact that I was born with it. This isn't necessarily disability focused inherently, but how do you choose, as a bilingual section editor, how do you choose what to cover? And how do you sort of think about what is, it sounds funny to say too much history, but one of the things we bumped into while making this series is, you know, how big can you make the info dump safely for the audience before it's just you're overwhelming with dates and figures and people? Like, how do you balance telling the history while also making it, you know, how do you choose what you cover and how do you make it readable?
Choosing what we cover is a bit of an art. It is very judgment-based, 100%. And especially in my case, I covered what we call the communities portfolio, which is anything really diversity related. So it could be Chinese Canadians, South Asian Canadians, disability related, but also I work on everything because I'm the bilingual subject editor. I work on almost everything related to Franco-Canadians also, including Quebec, which is massive, right? So choosing what to prioritize is always a challenge. My colleagues and I, and certainly more so my colleagues and I, we look to the news, see what is very pressing. Sometimes there are certain topics that are particularly on the minds of Canadians. Not so much in my side of the portfolio, but if there's a federal election, for sure, there's a prioritization of that for updates and stuff like that. I think the core of the question is like, how do I choose what topics to cover? And I think in my case, I'm here to, as I go back to that question of duty of representation, right? I'm not really interested in just rehashing existing stories on and on and on, just giving stories that already are incredibly popular even more attention. I'm here to cover the stories of people who are not talked about, but still have made a tremendous impact, positive impact typically on, or sometimes negative impact, but typically positive on my side of things. And as part of that duty of representation, it's never ending work, right? Like if there's a community in Canada and its presence is substantial, it's worth covering.
You know, obviously the episode was about disabled media workers. How do you think we can get more disabled folks involved doing in the kind of work that you do? Because I think it's a very particular, much needed, but a very particular skill set. And how do you think we create space for more disabled folks doing the work that you do?
It goes back to our we already talked so much about accessibility, but it's making sure, that publications and employers maximize accessibility out of consideration for equity of opportunity, right? This is essential because if you want people who tell good stories, who tell authentic stories, who bring really valuable, insightful perspectives, you need to make sure you have that equity of opportunity, right? And I don't mean this in like a generic HR manner. I mean, like truly having accessibility is a question of social justice also. Like, let's be very honest, right? A bit like you're being self-conscious about. But so for sure, accessibility, I think remote, honestly, in my opinion, there's no reason why people working in my field of history, but not just history, but just in kind of like covering Canadian society from a media education perspective, there's no reason why most publications cannot be remote. I think that's very, very important for accessibility. If most of the TC team had to commute to Toronto every day, I'm sorry, like they would cut out so many people already out. Right, but despite us being, in theory, a national publication, it does not make sense that you restrict people to one specific office. Say even if we manage to get disabled writers from Toronto, they have a very specific perspective that someone, say, I don't know, living in a rural area might not have, right? So I think definitely remote work is a huge part of it, but also just having leadership management that is able to be flexible with accommodating and be flexible for workplace environments so that there is that equity of opportunity. I think that's one aspect. I think it's also as a society, it goes back to our discussion, for example, on COVID-19 being a mass disabling event. I think it's valuing, also as a society, we need to value disabled people's perspectives a lot more because we have so much to learn in general from disabled community.
I've had gigs where some of them it's me pitching and going, "Hey, you have a hole here." I put in disability into your search bar and it didn't show up. I've also gotten to the point where folks will point me towards and say, "Hey, you should really go nag these people," or willing to talk about and I think that's a real growth in media in the last, certainly even since I started in this career, if we date back student media, 2012-ish, the number of things where you say, "Hey, you have you need some disability coverage here." And the answer isn't go away. The answer is
no.
it might be we don't have budget, but it's not, I don't think that's important. That certainly still happens, but I'm just saying it happens less now in my personal experience, than it would have done a little while ago.
I also feel that if a publication straight up said, "Oh, we don't care about disability, period," I think word would get around and word would get, going back to how journalism is a profession which relies a lot on word of mouth and reputational side of things.
There's so much where disability, like many other marginalizations, can fit into topics where you just niche it down that little extra bit. We have another episode that's on wheelchair rugby and how wheelchair rugby developed spanning first in Manitoba, then but how it spanned out to across the country, how it developed in Manitoba as the birthplace of the sport is different to how it, continues to develop in Atlantic Canada. And I think when we look at disability stories in media, there's so much opportunity to niche down further
absolutely.
Than we already are. There's so many opportunities to look at how different intersectional identities are and aren't thinking about disability. Sometimes it's the absence of thinking about disability that is the interesting thing to me as a disabled journalist.
For sure. I think a lot of publications and people in positions of authority have a lot of blind spots regarding all sorts of marginalizations. And this is why I think going back to writing in, complaining, that can be really helpful. Some great authors I've started collaborating with because they complain about our coverage. I had this author who was saying that our article on Filipino Canadians had some mistakes. And then, yet now he's one of the writers I've collaborated the most with in the past few years. So
yeah, and I think also the flip side of that, if I may say this as a disabled media worker, is if you see disability coverage that you think is good, I'm not religious, but for God's sake, tell them. Email that writer, email that editor, because not only is that a warm and fuzzy thing in somebody's email inbox, which I don't know about your email inbox, but warm and fuzzy is not how I would describe it most of the time. It also is a signifier to the outlet, even outlets that maybe traditionally don't cover disability as equitably. It is still a signifier to them that, hey, community cares about this. Our readers, our audiences care about this. And are willing to give feedback, and it's a step above the comment section.
Yeah.
To actually give tangible response.
Yeah, 100%. I think giving feedback, it doesn't always have to be, should not always be negative. Sometimes just a job well done is a job well done. And we should spread and celebrate these feats, honestly, these accomplishments of, especially when the topic is so underexplored, for example. I think 100%. Yeah. Even for a national publication like ours, it's incredibly nice to have a reader be like, I really enjoyed this. It means a lot.
Well, thanks so much, Clay. I think that's a really good space to end. But just to end off our conversation, if people want to find out more about your work and the things you cover, the things you edit, where can they go? Where can they find you?
Yeah. So as I mentioned, if you've been listening carefully, I'm an editor at the Canadian Encyclopedia. So you can visit us on the Canadian Encyclopedia.ca, or you can use your search engine of choice and write the Canadian Encyclopedia and you ask whatever question you want. Probably point you to the right article.
Thank you so much, Clay.
Yep. Thanks a lot, John.
Today's conversation shows how disability history isn't just shaped by major events, but who's telling those stories, how it's framed, and whether it's preserved at all. From journalism and education to lived experience and advocacy, the work of documenting disability history is ongoing, understudied, and yet essential. It's about making sure that disabled lives and people's contributions to our culture and our history aren't just remembered, but they're understood and implemented.
Thank you for tuning in to the companion podcast for AMI's History in 60. Be sure to watch History in 60 on AMI TV and online at AMI+. Join us next time as we continue exploring disability history and culture in Canada. If you enjoyed today's episode, please consider subscribing, downloading, and sharing it with someone who might learn from these stories. Every listen and view helps amplify disability history and the voices shaping change today.